Hello, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Emily, and I'm here with my colleague Matthew. We're both senior analysts at RANE, and we are going to be discussing today the Iran nuclear deal, or trying to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. So, just to kick us off, and this is a topic, Matthew, you and I have been talking about for
Mhm.
years, literally since I became an analyst at this company 7 years ago. That was the year that the JCPOA nuclear deal was implemented. It was signed the year prior, but it was implemented in 2016. And then in 2018, the Trump administration withdrew the US from that deal. A year later, Iran withdrew from the deal. And then we've had Iran advance its nuclear program substantially since that time. And now, over the last year and a half or so, we've seen the members of the JCPOA Commission try to find a way, perhaps, to come back into compliance with that deal. And right now, we're at this really precarious moment. And I wondered if you could just give us the current state of play of where we are at this moment with this deal.
Yeah, so on the 8th, the EU, which is acting as the coordinator of talks in Vienna, submitted what they're calling the final, of course, whether or not it's final is remains to be seen, draft text for the US to rejoin the pact and Iran to resume compliance with the pact. And the EU officials that have been working on it have basically said that the deal that's now in text is basically how far they can get through negotiations with the US and Iran to towards the deal. Now, Iran took about a week to respond. They responded formally this Monday. They basically said that there are still issues with the deal that we are concerned about, and they basically said that they are. It didn't go as far as they wanted when it comes to sanctions guarantees, i.e., basically something that would prevent the U.S. from withdrawing from the deal, say in 2024, if President Trump is reelected, Ron DeSantis, somebody from the Republican Party, the same way that President Trump did. There are multiple ways that we can look at this. I mean, that's the kind of status of where we're at. The U.S. is now still kind of responding to Iran's latest wrench in the process. But what we have seen now on multiple occasions, going back to when we were almost at a deal in early March, is that Iran has, on a number of occasions, opened up a new demand or going back to an old demand that they had been quiet on. Trying to what appears to be, um, always reaching for more without actually wanting to sign the deal or not really needing to make concessions to sign the deal. For example, if in February and March, we heard so much about how Iran was demanding that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who is like the elite military arm of Iran's military, basically demanding that they would be removed from the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations that President Trump put on. After a while, that when that was leaked in the U.S., that was a major political issue. The U.S. basically said no, and then we heard that Iran was demanding the end of an IAEA probe into undeclared activity at 3 Iranian nuclear sites. And then that kind of went away, and now we have this new demand. So they just are seeming to finding a lot of the new demands in order to really extend negotiations without ever actually having to conclude them. And it appears, at least in my eyes, that it seems like Iran wants to keep the dialogue open for negotiation as a way to ensure that the U.S., the EU don't go further aggressive. Like, for example, the EU triggering back the UN snapback of sanctions, which has not happened.
So, in a sense, your take, and I think I agree with this, is that Iran is buying time, but it perhaps doesn't exactly want to come back into compliance with the deal as it was written in 2015. I mean, have Iran's needs and desires changed since that time? This is
I
one of the
think the
concerns
something,
that
yeah,
that
something that I've been thinking about, and I've written and something that we'll be publishing soon is a piece that is looking at, well, are the original incentives for Iran to enter the deal the same that they were in 2014, 2015? And the answer is no, or at least I assess it to be no. For example, Iran had been, under the assumption essentially that negotiating the deal would unlock economic benefits under the Rouhani administration, which would mean an economic rejuvenation of Iran, putting it back into a global economic power, all these kinds of grand things that Rouhani was thinking about. However, now we've seen under the U.S., which was originally called the maximum pressure campaign, Iran has learned to live under sanctions for 4 years, like really harsh sanctions that they never really had to do before. That has taught the Iranian leadership that they can do that without. Now the economy is, struggling, but they are able to do that without, significant repercussions politically, to the point where there are enough protesters on the street that the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran is threatened by them. They seem to have that under control. And importantly, if they were to sign this deal, this is why the sanctions guarantees are so important. Um, it's not, it's an open question as to whether or not Western companies have any interest in increasing their business in Iran. Yeah, there'll be oil trade, but that is an important thing for Iran. It's a massive thing for the government. But when you talk about broad economic gains for Iranian society, investment in FDI into all kinds of Iranian sectors. Remember, most people don't work in the oil sector. That broader investment may not happen. Why would a company like, say, for example, Renault, or a European car maker, automaker, why would they go into the Iranian market right now? You have to not only deal with the risk of sanctions being snapped back on. You also have to worry about a very difficult domestic operating environment with corruption and all kinds of things. So I do think that Iran, the way they're viewing the economic benefits is different, and the way that they're viewing their ability to withstand pressure is the same. Now, with that being said, I think we both agree that a deal is still possible. There are still, of course, benefits. The oil revenue is a big thing. Also, another major benefit would be, for example, a lot of the sanctions that were, or sorry, a lot of the sanctions that the U.S. was going to be is putting into place right now. Under the deal, originally they were supposed to be starting moving away to removing those sanctions in 2023, in 2024, and 2025. Those sunset clauses are basically around the corner, and that is actually some sort of an incentive for Iran to get back into the deal, say, hey, look, you actually now have to move on these sunset clauses because we're in the deal again. And from the U.S. perspective, that's not going to fly.
Right, totally. I mean, you just touched on a lot of really interesting points. And one of the main things that we discuss when we're analyzing any issue, but especially this issue, and you and I have debated on this for hours over the years, is this idea of like Iran's motivations. Why would Iran want this? Why would it not want this? And obviously, that's very key as we're sort of gauging: is it likely that they come back into compliance with this deal, or is it not? And I totally agree that sort of Iran's imperatives have shifted somewhat. And it's not a plain and simple question of, oh, if Iran signs this deal, they immediately get sanctions relief and the economy is great and oil is being exported in large numbers again and everything's hunky dory. That's just not that's not how it works. And the reticence that you point to of European firms that were really involved in the Iranian economy before, before 2011 and 2012, when we had like a big wave of Western sanctions on Iran because of its nuclear program. It's not going to be this immediate sort of gates opening and companies are going to be sweeping into the Iranian economy. There will be interest there because this is a huge country with a huge oil sector, massive amount of human capital, but it's not going to be this, easy one-to-one. And I think that's where it gets really important to sort of parse out the really unique nuances in Iran's motivation. And one point that we've talked about a lot, and that you wrote about in this piece that I think will be coming out in the next several days or week or so, is this idea that not immediately coming back into compliance with this deal also provides something of a boost to this idea of the resistance economy that has been this tenet, this idea present in among Iran's leadership since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And it's this idea, of course, that Iran can withstand external pressure, that it can rely on itself, that it doesn't need to be dependent on the West or the East or anybody else really to provide its own sort of economic motor for development. And not rushing to get back into a deal that in some ways can make Iran look dependent on Western investment um, is kind of a boost to that idea. And as you pointed to, over the last 4 years, since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, Iran's economy hasn't crumbled, and it certainly has faced significant headwinds. Inflation is one of them. We could go into all sorts of the headwinds that are there, but it hasn't crumbled. And as you point to, the protests that we've seen that are economically motivated haven't brought the Iranian government to its knees. And so the confidence that they might have now is greater, that they don't need to accept just any deal. They want to accept a deal that is really, really, really within Iran's favor. And the last thing I'll say about that resistance economy idea is something that you and I both definitely agree on, which is that if you don't sign the deal and you still have significant sanctions burdening Iran's economy, you have something to point to blame for the economic problems that Iranians are facing, which in many ways are a result of sanctions, but are not solely a result of sanctions. But if you have sanctions to point to and to blame, that gives the Iranian government somebody else to blame, somebody to shift blame. And I think that's really important for this current administration under President Ibrahim Raisi, which has only been in power just over a year. And so that's just, I think I just wanted to expound a little bit more on that question of sort of Iran's motivations.
Yeah, and I think though, moving forward, and I do have a question about Israel that I want to ask you after a few thoughts here, is that if we do not have a deal, which I think we both assess to be still slightly unlikely, or still unlikely, well, that means the question, well, what's next for Iran's nuclear program? It's already stockpiling highly enriched uranium up to 60%, more than it ever has. That's not a lot when it comes to going to weapons grade 90% enrichment. Iran, more or less, if it really wanted to build a crude nuclear device to have an explosion within a few months, it can do that. Will they go to that strategy, or will they quietly do it and then just announce that they have done it? That kind of a thing. These are all things that are now becoming more a pertinent question here in the U.S., in Israel, now even increasingly in, of course, Europe. And if we do have that, or get towards that stage, what is Israel's reaction? What is the U.S. reaction? Are we going to get back to this scenario where the U.S. and Israel try to organize a military strike against an Iranian facility or something like that as a way to set back Iran's nuclear program? And then, unfortunately for the U.S. and Iran or in Israel, a military strike or even covert activity in Iran's nuclear program, it sets it back. It doesn't destroy it, and in many ways, it reinforces Iran's competing strategic drive of a nuclear weapon, which it still views as something that is a security issue, or a weapon that can be a deterrence through more aggression by the United States and Israel in its view of aggression, of course. But we did have a few yesterday and today some statements coming out of Israel by the Israeli Prime Minister. Can you tell me what he said?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you bring up the important question of Israel, which we are asked about all the time. And speaking of asking about, if anyone has a question live while we're talking about this, please type it in, and we can address that question. But yes, we get asked about Israel a lot. Israel's motivation is again another one of these examples where you can't look at it through a simple lens. There's a lot of different nuances here. Um, and Israel also, we know that within Israel's government, there's a big debate going on. But I digress. I go back to your question. Yair Lapid, the prime minister in Israel, yesterday was speaking with U.S. officials as well as German officials, with the German chancellor, about Israel's concerns regarding this August 8th EU draft of the nuclear deal. Basically saying, he basically said, hey, this is not sufficient for your concerns, and heavily implying, and in some ways directly saying, like, this is certainly not enough for Israel's concerns regarding what Iran could do with this kind of um, freedom that could be allotted to Iran in terms of sanctions relief, if this deal does go through, which we could find out in the next days, weeks. This really is, like, we're at this really critical juncture where, if the US comes back and says yes to this, and Iran says yes, and the EU says yes, and the E3 says yes, then we could be moving towards this happening, which is why this is like this really precarious moment. Israel's prime minister expressing those concerns echoes similar concerns that Israel's leadership has made in the past. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, of course, made headlines sort of speaking about Israel's concerns and fears about the advancing nuclear program. But you point to how, even if Israel does move forward and conducts more covert operations against Iran's nuclear program, seeking to degrade Iran's capabilities and slow down the nuclear breakout time, that time that it would take to build a nuclear weapon. Even if Israel does that, Israel is fully cognizant, we are sure, that that doesn't mean that the threat is ever gone. And I think that that's why there's a debate happening within Israel in some cases between the IDF and between Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, but also within those bodies about, okay, well, would supporting this current draft nuclear deal be in our favor? Is it better to sort of have something in place that would freeze some aspects of Iran's nuclear program, which of course is what the nuclear deal is trying to do? Would it be better for Israel's security for that to happen? Or, you know, there are those who take a really, really, really realistic view of it, and they say, and a really sort of critical and more hardline view of it, saying we shouldn't take Iran's word for granted at all, and we shouldn't trust them at all, and they're always going to have Israel in their crosshairs. So there's a debate going on in Israel, and that makes it really complicated. I think what we can be sure of is that Israel is never going to fully trust that Iran is abiding by anything that it agrees to, just not with this current Iranian leadership, not with the current Israeli leadership. It's difficult to imagine a future in the near term where these governments trust each other and aren't adversarial. So it's very likely that Israel will continue to seek opportunities to try and degrade that nuclear program. If there's a deal signed, even this EU draft deal that's circulating in these current days, it could make it a little more difficult for Israel to do something, public, because that would be sort of acting against the interests of something that the US and the EU and Germany and the UK and France have signed. But it's certainly something that all those actors know that Israel's always going to be acting in its own interest. And so that Israel-Iran sort of shadow war that we've been watching is definitely just going to continue. We have a question here. Do you consider that Russia has already supplied key components and fissile material by the backdoor to Iran already, simply as a rumor? I mean, that's a really interesting question. And we know that, Matthew, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now there is a lot of rumors flying around about fissile material, things like that. But I think it's worth noting that there are still certain sort of safeguards that are put into place. Not all of those have been suspended under the IAEA. It's just additional protocol, additional monitoring capabilities that were agreed as a part beyond the typical agreement that Iran has suspended. We have to remember that as a part of the JCPOA, Iran was supposed to be cooperating with Russia around some of its nuclear activity as a way to ensure that the modernization, for example, of one of the Iranian reactors was going to go through and not have a higher risk of proliferation. They were converting a heavy water reactor to a light water reactor, basically, and they were also having the export of certain enriched materials and also heavy water to Russia as a part of that agreement. So the idea of cooperation, and especially at the civilian level, between Russia and Iran was always at the heart of JCPOA. I don't think that alone is something that is necessarily a bad thing, and I don't think necessarily it's in Russia's interest for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's one of the things I think we haven't really touched on is Russia and China's role in these negotiations, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
They are a part of the Joint Commission. They are essentially the balancing act to the U.S. and the West. But I think we have to remember that we would never have had the original JCPOA if China and Russia didn't approve UN sanctions on Iran in the first place. You
True.
look at the way that China and Russia are viewing the Middle East, the way that China and Russia are viewing Central Asia. Russia has almost no interest on having another nuclear armed state on its periphery. They're already dealing with that in NATO and in Turkey with the United States. They're already dealing with that with China. They're already to a degree dealing with that with North Korea. And they probably recognize that if Iran does develop a nuclear weapon, that also probably results in it results in Israel declaring that it has nuclear weapons, and Saudi Arabia trying to get to nuclear weapons or come under the U.S. shield, which they would not want. So I don't.
The whole
So it is a
regional
lot of bad things for Russia to actually go that far. Though that doesn't mean that the Russians and the Chinese won't take a similar stand or a stand to support Iran's claims that the U.S. and the EU are the ones violating the deal the most. They will certainly back Iran's position there, but I think it's a little bit of a little bit going too far to say that Russia would actually actively support Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon.
Right. I think that's a really important point, and another example of how you can't look at it through this simple lens. You can't look at it as, just from this um this hawkish sort of US perspective of, oh, China and Russia and Iran are all on this one team. Iran, in many ways, doesn't want to be on those teams. It wants to be on its own team. And it has benefited from Russian diplomatic and economic support in a huge way in the past, and also on Chinese diplomatic and economic support in the past. But that absolutely does not translate into those countries supporting Iran's efforts to become more of a regional hegemon, and building up its nuclear program is a part of that.
And he did underscore that earlier when he said that Iran doesn't want to be, dependent on China and Russia. Iran did last year sign that 25-year, what was the figure, $400 billion strategic partnership with China. We wrote basically that's, a little bit going too far to call it this whopping, strategic alliance. Iran, for many reasons, doesn't want to be dependent on any foreign power, whether it be China, the U.S., or Russia. You go back, a couple centuries. What was the big thing that Iran was always really afraid of? Being influenced by Britain and Russia. So there is a lot of historical baggage here that I think that Iran is well aware of. And if you just go back, Emily, to I believe it was 2018 or 2017, when we had the rumors, or not even the rumors, the use of military bases in Iran by Russia to send weapons to Syria, that caused major backlash in Iran, specifically because it was viewed as a foreign power having, a military base on Iranian soil, and that one was Russia, not the U.S.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Man, there's so many different angles we could take this down, but we have been talking about this for 22 minutes. We could talk about it for hours more, but this is probably a great place to start. There's a lot more that both Matthew and I have written and other analysts have written about this on ranenetwork.com. So you could learn more about RANE's geopolitical intelligence solution at ranenetwork.com. Thank you for joining us.